Welcome to the case of the Vanishing Violinist, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Feminine Mystique. Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, playing in the year 1896. It was during some recent renovations at our old lodgings, 221B Baker Street, that a most curious trunk was unearthed from the very depths of the attic. Within lay not merely dust-laden relics of a bygone era, but a collection of personal diaries and letters, intimate accounts penned by the very women whose lives intersected with Mr. Sherlock Holmes's many investigations, particularly between the years 1888 and 1914. These narratives, which I have since come to term the feminine mystique, Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, offer a remarkable and often surprising counterpoint to my own published chronicles. They reveal the hidden currents of an age where societal conventions were increasingly questioned, and Holmes himself frequently found his assumptions and methods profoundly challenged by women of extraordinary spirit and intellect, navigating a world on the cusp of change. And so, let us delve into the first of these rediscovered accounts. It concerns a most perplexing affair, one which I have recorded as the case of the Vanishing Violinist. Chapter 1. Outside, familiar London sounds formed a backdrop to our quiet. The rumble of drays, a distant newsboy's cry, and the sharp clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Holmes was absorbed in a monograph, while I perused medical journals. Our peace was shattered by frantic rapping at the front door, urgent, heavy blows that spoke of profound agitation. Soon, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascended the stairs, followed by a heavier, hurried tread. "Mr. Holmes, Sherlock Holmes. I must see him. It is a matter of the utmost urgency," responded Mr. Alastair Finch. The voice was strained with anxiety. Before Mrs. Hudson could announce him, the door burst open. A portly gentleman, face florid and perspiring despite the cool air, rushed in, clutching his silk hat, his overcoat askew. "Pray be seated, sir. You appear distressed," declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes gestured to an armchair, his keen eyes missing no detail of our visitor's disarray. The man, however, remained standing, incapable of stillness. "Distressed? Mr. Holmes, it's a catastrophe. I'm Alastair Finch, manager of the Royal Albert Concert Hall. Madame Evangeline Dubois. She's vanished," responded Mr. Alastair Finch. He wrung his hands, his gaze darting about. The name Madame Dubois was familiar. The papers had lauded her recent triumphs as a violinist of extraordinary talent. "Vanished? From where, Mr. Finch, and under what circumstances?" Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes's voice was calm, a stark contrast to Finch's near hysteria. "From her dressing room, locked, not an hour ago. She was due to perform this very evening a pivotal concert, Mr. Holmes, pivotal. The hall is sold out. Critics from across Europe are in attendance. This will ruin me. It will ruin the hall," replied Mr. Alastair Finch. His emphasis on the commercial implications was not lost on my friend, whose lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "You say the room was locked. From the inside, presumably," Sherlock Holmes responded. Yes, we had to force the door. She was simply gone, only this on her dressing table," Mr. Alastair Finch replied. Finch fumbled in his pocket, producing a small, sealed envelope, which he thrust towards Holmes. His hand trembled slightly as he did so. "And you have, of course, alerted the police," observed Sherlock Holmes. "The police, Mr. Holmes, this requires discretion, subtlety. The police will create a scandal. I need her found, quietly and before the concert. You are my only hope. You must come to the hall at once. I shall direct your inquiries. I know everyone, everything that transpires there," responded Mr. Alastair Finch. Holmes took the envelope but did not open it. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, his gaze fixed upon Mr. Finch with an unnerving intensity. "Your concern for Madame Dubois' welfare appears secondary to your concern for the evening's receipts, Mr. Finch. And while I appreciate your offer to direct, my inquiries. I generally find my own methods more effective. Tell me everything from the beginning and omit no detail, however trivial it may seem to you." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Deflated by Holmes's cool assessment, Mr. Finch began a rambling account. He clearly viewed the violinist's disappearance as an affront to his schedule. As he spoke, the mantelpiece clock's tick-tock underscored his urgency, yet Holmes remained calmly attentive. Interesting, a locked room, a vanished artist, and a manager more agitated by potential financial loss than by the fate of his star. "Watson, I believe a visit to this concert hall is indeed in order. The stage is set, it would seem, for a most unusual performance," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He rose, a spark of anticipation now evident in his eyes. The game, as he was so fond of saying, was afoot. Our hansom cab clattered to a halt before the Lyceum Theatre. Gone was its usual daytime bustle, replaced now by an air of anxious quiet that seemed to cling to its grand facade. From somewhere within, the faint, mournful sigh of a draught whispered through unseen cracks. Mr. Alastair Finch, his face still etched with the strain I had noted earlier, met us at the stage door. The jangle of his keys was a nervous counterpoint to the distant, muffled sounds of a city already stirring to its morning tasks. He led us through a labyrinth of shadowy corridors. The air was thick with the scent of dust, grease paint, and old velvet. The hollow echo of our footsteps on the bare boards seemed to amplify the theater's current emptiness, a silence broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling around us. His voice was tight, almost a whisper. "This way, Mr. Holmes. Her dressing room has remained untouched precisely as we found it. A veritable fortress, and yet," Mr. Alastair Finch answered. He gestured towards a narrow door, upon which Madame Dubois' name was painted in elegant, albeit slightly faded, gold lettering. Holmes paused, his keen eyes sweeping the corridor, the only sound the faint rustle of his coat. He then nodded for Finch to proceed. The manager fumbled with a key, the lock grating loudly in the oppressive silence, before swinging the door inward with a soft groan of old hinges. The room was small, yet opulently appointed. A dressing table stood laden with pots and powders, beside it a vase of wilting roses. A single, tall window, securely latched, overlooked a grim brick wall, offering no view but a canvas for the city's muted hum. The scent of violets, faint but discernible, hung in the air. Holmes stepped inside, his movements precise and economical, his gaze already cataloguing every detail. I noted the heavy bolt on the inside of the door, shot firmly home. The silence in the room felt heavy, disturbed only by the almost inaudible tick of a forgotten timepiece on the mantel. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and thoughtful. "The door bolted from within, Finch. The window, as you see, is fastened and allows no egress for an adult. The fireplace offers no escape. The chimney is narrow and choked with soot. Let us examine further," Sherlock Holmes noted. With that, Holmes began a more intensive scrutiny. He moved with a quiet precision, tapping along the wainscoting, his knuckles producing only the dull thud of solid wood. He pressed against sections of the floral wallpaper, searching for the telltale give of a hidden panel or a concealed doorway. His gaze swept the floorboards, noting their age and condition, looking for any signs of recent disturbance or a cleverly disguised trapdoor. Even the heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, and the space behind them meticulously checked. He then turned his attention to the ceiling, though its height and plainness offered little promise. He ran his fingers along the edges of the ornate, slightly dusty, plaster cornices, his eyes sharp for any irregularity. The very air of the room seemed to hold its breath as he worked. "No, there is no artifice here, Finch. No secret passages known to the casual observer, at least. The room, for all intents and purposes, was sealed. We have, it appears, a classic locked room puzzle," replied Sherlock Holmes. "A classic indeed, Holmes, and one that defies immediate explanation. The room appears utterly sealed from this side, wondered Dr. John Watson. Impossible, I tell you. Finch's voice cracked with desperation. He wrung his hands, pacing in a tight circle. She was due on stage. How could she simply vanish? Said Mr. Alastair Finch. Holmes, however, paid little heed to Finch's distress, his entire focus consumed by the silent testimony of the room. He knelt, the slight creak of his boots on the floorboards the only sound, as he examined the area near the door with an intensity that missed nothing. He then ran a delicate finger along the window sill, his brow furrowed in concentration. The question is not merely how, Mr. Finch, but whether this was a vanishing of her own volition or one orchestrated by another. The nature of the lark suggests intent. But whose? Remarked Sherlock Holmes. A crucial distinction, Holmes. The answer will undoubtedly shape our entire inquiry. Asked Dr. John Watson. Before either Holmes could elaborate or I could offer further comment, a quiet knock sounded at the door, its suddenness making us all start. He started. Ah, that will be Sarah Moffat, the seamstress. You asked to speak with someone familiar with Madame Dubois' habits, remarked Mr. Alastair Finch. A young woman entered, the soft rustle of her skirts preceding her. Her expression was serious, her eyes sharp and observant. She curtsied briefly. Holmes rose and regarded her with interest. Miss Moffat, your insights into Madame Dubois' recent demeanor would be invaluable. Did you notice anything amiss, anything unusual in her behavior leading up to last night? Stated Sherlock Holmes. Her voice was clear and steady. Madame has been overwrought, sir, for some weeks. The pressure of the performance, I believe. She kept more to herself than usual, and I often heard her pacing in here, the sound restless, like a caged bird. Yesterday, she seemed particularly distracted, her eyes darting about as if expecting someone or something, said Sarah Moffat. As Sarah Moffat spoke, her words painting a picture of Madame Dubois' anxiety, Holmes's gaze drifted. It settled upon a small, leather-bound music folio resting on a velvet chaise longue. His expression became suddenly intent. He moved towards it, the floorboards groaning faintly beneath his weight. He picked up the folio, and as he did, a single sheet of paper fluttered from within its pages to the floor with a soft whisper. It was not a letter, but a piece of manuscript paper, bearing a short, rather unconventional sequence of musical notes, hastily scrawled. He retrieved it, a flicker of something akin to triumph in his eyes. Watson, observe, this is no mere doodle, nor a fragment of a forgotten symphony, deduced Sherlock Holmes. What is it, Holmes? I asked, leaning closer. Commented Dr. John Watson. His voice was firm, cutting through the room's quiet tension. It is a communication, Watson, deliberate, purposeful. Madame Dubois may have vanished, but she has left us a most intriguing composition. The challenge now is to discern its meaning, for I believe it holds the key to her state of mind, and perhaps her destination, declared Sherlock Holmes. He held the paper aloft, the cryptic notes seeming to dance before my eyes. The silence in the small room was profound, broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the Thames, a sound that seemed to underscore the mystery before us. It was clear that our investigation had just struck its first, significant chord. The cryptic musical notations Madame Dubois had left behind lay upon the dusty table in our Baker Street lodgings. Holmes, however, paced before the fireplace, his mind clearly already back amidst the cavernous backstage labyrinth of the Lyceum. The echo of our footsteps from those shadowy corridors seemed to linger in the room, a reminder of the silence that had fallen where music should have reigned. He paused, holding the curious scrap of paper aloft. He had declared it a deliberate communication, not a mere whim, and his next step was clear. His voice, usually so crisp, held a thoughtful timbre. The theater staff, Watson, they are the eyes and ears of such a place. Amongst their chatter and routine, we may find the key to Madame Dubois' state of mind, or even the identity of her unseen collaborator, if such a one exists, stated Sherlock Holmes. And so, the following morning found us once more navigating the bewildering array of passages behind the grand stage. The air hung thick with the scent of old velvet and dust. A faint aroma of gaslight lingered. From above, a rope creaked rhythmically. Our first encounter was with a Mrs. Higgins, a dresser whose hands still nervously pleated her apron as she spoke, her voice a low, anxious murmur. Oh, Madame Dubois, a sweet lady, sir, but so fraught. The closer it came to the performance, the worse she became. Kept to herself, she did. Said the applause felt like thunder and not the good kind, said Mrs. Higgins. His tone was gentle, encouraging. Did you observe anything unusual on the day of her disappearance, Mrs. Higgins? Any visitors? Any particular agitation beyond what you describe as her norm? Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. No visitors, sir, not that I saw. But she was paler than usual, and her hands, they trembled so when I helped with her gown. She kept looking at the door as if expecting someone or something, remarked Mrs. Higgins. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze distant. We next spoke with Mr. Barlow, the assistant stage manager, a harried man whose words tumbled out in a rush, punctuated by the distant thud of a dropped stage weight that reverberated through the floorboards. He spoke with a brusque efficiency. Dubois, difficult, immensely talented, no doubt, but wound tighter than a drum. Finch, the manager, was always at her, pushing. She'd asked about canceling the performance twice last week, said she wasn't ready. Finch wouldn't hear of it, of course. Reputation, ticket sales, you understand, remarked Mr. Barlow. This painted a picture of mounting pressure. It confirmed Holmes's initial thoughts that the locked room, far from being an impenetrable fortress breached by a phantom, might instead conceal a desperate act of volition. The cryptic note, the known anxieties, the very performance of disappearance. It all hinted at a mind seeking escape, not one forcibly taken. Yet the precision of it troubled him. It was too neat for simple panic. The accounts, while varied in their specifics, all pointed to a woman under immense strain. A heavy sigh escaped me, the weight of her predicament palpable even in its recounting. It was then that a grizzled stagehand, one Elias Thorne, approached. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing slightly in the vast space, his voice a low rumble, as if hesitant to disturb the quiet of the empty stage. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes. Heard you were asking about Madame. There was something, just before she was due on. I was up in the flies, checking a counterweight, answered Elias Thorne. Holmes's attention sharpened instantly. Proceed, Mr. Thorne. Every detail is of importance, declared Sherlock Holmes. Well, sir, I saw a figure down in the corridor. Leading to her dressing room it was. Just a shadow, really, moving quick-like. Couldn't see a face, but it weren't one of us regulars. 2. Furtive, if you catch my meaning, Elias Thorne answered. Could you describe this person further? I interjected, leaning forward, commented Dr. John Watson. He shook his head, the words slow and deliberate. Not really, sir. Medium height, dark clothes. Moved like they knew where they were going, but didn't want to be seen doing it. Vanished towards the stage door exit, it seemed, said Elias Thorne. Holmes remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the stagehand. The distant clang of a closing door echoed from somewhere deep within the theater's recesses. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and decisive. This shadowy figure, Watson, is of paramount interest. Either they are a confederate in Madame Dubois' flight, perhaps a necessary accomplice to navigate these warrens unseen, or they represent an entirely different, and perhaps more sinister, element. A third party, Watson, whose motives are yet unknown, could complicate this matter far beyond a simple desire to escape the limelight, explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paused, his gaze sweeping the dusty stage before us. a faint draft stirring the cobwebs in a dark corner. The conflicting reports of her anxiety suggest a woman pushed to her limits, perhaps even to the point of orchestrating her own vanishing. But this figure introduces a new dynamic, a variable that does not neatly fit the narrative of a distraught artist fleeing her obligations. Was this person an aide, a coercer, or an opportunist stumbling into a pre-existing crisis? We are not merely dealing with a case of nerves, I suspect, nor a straightforward flight. The plot, as they say in these very halls, thickens, and its threads may be more tangled and far-reaching than we initially perceived. Sherlock Holmes responded. He turned then, his gaze sweeping the empty orchestra pit, the rows of silent seats. A lone sheet of music rustled on a distant stand, disturbed by an unseen current of air. The information we had gathered was a tapestry of whispers and anxieties, but Thorne's account was a stark new thread. It was clear to me that to unravel this mystery, Holmes would need more than the accounts of those officially employed here. He would require insight into the hidden currents of this world, the unspoken truths known only to those who moved within its less visible strata. I could see the familiar glint in his eye. The hunt was truly afoot. Following Holmes's cryptic summons, I accompanied him not to the grand theater of our recent inquiries, but to a modest tea shop on a quiet street near Theobald's Road. The air within was thick with the aroma of brewing tea and fresh bread. The clinking of cups provided a soothing counterpoint to the muffled rumble of London traffic outside. He surveyed the room, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "An invaluable network, Watson," he remarked in a low tone, "possessing ears and eyes in places often invisible to the official constabulary. We seek perspectives here that the stagehands and managers, for all their proximity, cannot offer." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. We were guided to a curtained alcove where three women sat, their conversation ceasing as we approached. Sarah Moffat, a seamstress for the theater with intelligent eyes and nimble fingers, introduced herself. Her companions were Eliza, a thoughtful milliner's assistant, and Martha, a lady's maid with a direct, no-nonsense gaze. All possessed an air of quiet strength. A hush fell, punctuated by the distant hiss of a tea urn. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Sarah Moffat began, her voice clear and steady despite the somewhat clandestine nature of our meeting. "We understand you seek to unravel the mystery of Madame Dubois' vanishing," answered Sarah Moffat. Holmes inclined his head. Soon the women were speaking, not in whispers, but with controlled earnestness, painting a vivid picture of the life of a celebrated woman, a life far removed from the glittering facade presented to the public. Eliza, the milliner's assistant, explained, her voice gentle yet earnest. "The pressure, sirs, is immense. Every note she played, every gown she wore, subjected to the harshest scrutiny. A woman in her position is never truly free from the public gaze," said Eliza. Martha, the lady's maid, added, her tone firm, "and the expectations, Mr. Holmes, to be ever gracious, ever perfect. Madame Dubois, for all her talent, is a sensitive soul. We saw how the constant demands wore her down, sir, like water on stone," answered Martha. I observed Holmes. He listened with palpable intensity, his customary impatience absent. His gaze remained fixed upon Sarah Moffat as she prepared to speak again, her earlier observations clearly having piqued his interest. "We do not believe Madame Dubois was taken against her will, Mr. Holmes," Sarah stated, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "We believe she sought an escape." She leaned in, compelling us closer. I observed her myself in the days before the performance. She seemed hunted, not by any person, mind you, but by the performance itself. She spoke often of a desire for quiet, for anonymity. She even mentioned a small cottage her aunt once owned in the countryside. "A place of peace," she called it, Sarah Moffat replied. A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. He leaned back, the creak of his chair barely audible above the shop's low hum. The information regarding the shadowy figure backstage, which had so occupied his thoughts, receded in importance. Indeed, Holmes mused, his voice thoughtful. The cage of public expectation, Watson, can be far more confining than any locked room. This shadowy figure may well have been an ally, a facilitator of escape, rather than a perpetrator of abduction. You suggest she orchestrated this disappearance herself, explained Sherlock Holmes. It is what we feel, sir, Sarah Moffat affirmed. She was increasingly agitated, yes, but also methodical. I recall her asking me to mend a specific traveling cloak, one she hadn't used in years. And she had a particular fondness for certain calming herbal scents, always keeping a sachet nearby to soothe her nerves before a performance. Small things, perhaps, but telling, Sarah Moffat answered. Holmes sat upright, his eyes gleaming with newfound insight. As the vague theories crystallized into a tangible line of inquiry, the scent of damp wool from a newly arrived patron wafted into our alcove. Holmes said, "A calming scent, you say? Interesting. Such personal comforts are often overlooked in the initial chaos of an investigation, deemed insignificant. Yet, in a meticulously planned departure, such a detail might be intentionally left or unintentionally forgotten. Watson, our next port of call must be Madame Dubois' dressing room. There may yet be a fragrant clue awaiting our discovery, one previously obscured by more dramatic, yet ultimately misleading, possibilities," explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes rose, his energy renewed. The insights of these observant women had demonstrably shifted his perspective, turning his attention from external threats to the internal landscape of Madame Dubois' mind. As we prepared to depart, the distant cry of a lavender seller echoed from the street, a curious premonition of the aromatic search ahead. The conversation with the sisterhood had, as Holmes later admitted, cast a new and revealing light upon Madame Dubois' singular disappearance. Their insights into the anxieties plaguing the violinist, her profound fear of public scrutiny despite her talent, had evidently sparked a fresh train of thought in my friend's keen mind. We left their modest meeting place, their earnest voices still echoing faintly, and Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent for several blocks, brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly, his voice, sharp and decisive, cut the damp evening air. "Watson, there is a particular detail mentioned by young Miss Moffat regarding Madame Dubois' habits before a performance that I believe we have grievously overlooked. We returned to the Lyceum at once," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He hailed a cab, and soon we rattled over the cobblestones, the hooves a familiar London rhythm. Miss Moffat, the astute seamstress whose observations resonated with Holmes, accompanied us. Upon arrival, the theater was a cavern of echoing quiet, a stark contrast to the night of the vanishing. The dressing room air was stale, heavy with old cosmetics and faint perfume. Dust motes danced in the flickering light of the single gas lamp Holmes had insisted on lighting. The initial search was thorough, yet focused on the obvious, he mused, his gaze sweeping the room. We sought signs of struggle, of egress, of another's presence. But what if the clue lies not in what was done to her, but what she herself required for her state of mind? Miss Moffat, you mentioned Madame Dubois' reliance on certain calming influences, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Her voice was steady, though tinged with a natural deference. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. She was always particular about scents, said they helped her focus, settle her nerves. She had a small collection of them, not perfumes for wearing out, but more personal things," Sarah Moffat said. Holmes nodded, his eyes on a small vanity table cluttered with pots and vials. He bypassed these, his attention drawn to a recessed shelf beneath, nearly hidden by velvet. He knelt, floorboards creaking softly, and reached into the shadow. "Ah, what have we here?" he murmured, observed Sherlock Holmes. He withdrew his hand, revealing a small, rather plain sachet of faded silk no larger than a lady's watch. He held it out. A delicate, yet distinct fragrance emanated, a complex blend of dried herbs and flowers, unlike any common potpourri I had encountered. Sarah Moffat leaned closer, her expression suddenly intent. A small gasp escaped her. "Why, that's it. That's a special blend. Lavender and chamomile, I think, but there's something else, something sharper. Bergamot, perhaps, and a touch of valerian. Only one place I know sells a mix quite like that, sir. Old Mrs. Albrighton, the herbalist, down in 7 Dials. A peculiar shop known only to a few," remarked Sarah Moffat. Holmes's eyes gleamed with familiar intensity. He brought the sachet to his own nose, inhaling deeply. Indeed, valerian, a known calmative, overlooked, Watson, as a mere personal trifle. Yet its presence, and its anxiety-soothing nature, speaks volumes of Madame Dubois' mental state before her performance. This was not for pleasant aroma. It was a necessity, a crutch for profound stage fright. And its unique origin, Miss Moffat, gives us our first tangible thread from this locked room. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He carefully placed the sachet into an evidence envelope. The dressing room's silence pressed in, now charged with new possibility. A visit to an herbalist in 7 Dials was our next step, and I felt that familiar anticipation. The game was truly, and most intriguingly, afoot. Holmes's discovery of the peculiarly scented sachet led us on a winding journey through London's lesser-known byways. The jingle of harness and clap of hooves faded as we stopped before a small, unassuming shop, its window dusty with herbs. A faint, sweetish aroma, like the sachet, drifted out, mingling with the city's coal smoke. A bell clanged tinily as Holmes pushed open the door. The dim interior, lit by a single, softly hissing gas lamp, cast long shadows on shelves laden with bundles and jars. The air was thick, with countless blended fragrances. A profound quiet reigned, broken only by the faint rustle of our movements and the muffled rumble of distant traffic. A small, wizened woman with sharp, suspicious eyes peered at us from behind a counter cluttered with scales, mortars, and pestles. "Good afternoon," Holmes began, his voice calm yet authoritative. "We're inquiring about a particular herb blend. I believe it originates from your establishment," replied Sherlock Holmes. Her voice was thin and reedy as she replied. "Many blends come from this shop, sir. Many customers," remarked the herbalist. Holmes produced the small sachet from his pocket, its faded silk a stark contrast to his dark coat. He held it out. He spoke evenly, this one specifically. "Its aroma is quite distinctive," deduced Sherlock Holmes. The herbalist barely glanced at it, her gaze darting from Holmes to myself and back again, a nervous energy thrumming beneath her stillness. The only sound for a moment was the faint hiss of the gas lamp. She spoke quickly, her words almost tumbling over one another. "Potpourri. Yes, I sell such things. For sleep, for nerves. Many ladies buy them," said the herbalist. His tone sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed. And was one such lady Madame Evangeline Dubois, the violinist?" observed Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or fear, crossed the old woman's face before she smoothed it into an expression of blank incomprehension. The scent of dried rosemary seemed to intensify around us. Her voice was a little too firm, her denial a shade too swift. "Dubois, I know no such name. I have many customers, as I said. I do not recall everyone," remarked the herbalist. Holmes's grey eyes swept the shop. He noted a row of large glass jars behind the counter. One, labeled valerian root for tranquility, was far more depleted than its neighbors. Nearby, a smaller container of dried hops and lavender stood almost empty. His gaze then shifted to an open, leather-bound ledger on a side table, its pages filled with spidery script. Near the scales, a faint dusting of pale powder like that from the sachet lay on the counter. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of certainty. Your stock of valerian root and hops appears unusually low, madam, and I observe a ledger there, likely detailing your sales. Madame Dubois, I gather, was a frequent purchaser of remedies for anxiety, particularly in the days leading up to her performances. A rather substantial order, I would venture, was placed quite recently, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The herbalist's composure visibly crumbled. Her hands, which had been tightly clasped, began to tremble, and she nervously plucked at her apron. The silence in the shop was broken only by her shallow, unsteady breathing. She looked from Holmes to the depleted jars and back again, her earlier defiance evaporating like mist. Her voice was now a mere whisper, tinged with apprehension. She did come here, for her nerves. They were very bad, poor soul, especially of late, always asking for stronger blends, remarked the herbalist. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. His voice remained quiet, yet insistent. And did anyone else show interest in these particular calming herbs? Or perhaps an interest in Madame Dubois herself? Another musician, perhaps. A conductor, even, Sherlock Holmes noted. She hesitated, her eyes darting towards the door as if contemplating escape. Then, with a weighted sigh that seemed to carry some unspoken burden, she admitted, there was another. A tall gentleman, foreign accent. He asked about her, about what she bought. Said he was concerned for her well-being. Maestro Karloff, he called himself, responded the herbalist. Holmes's expression remained impassive, but I saw a flicker of keen interest in his eyes. He repeated softly, the name hanging in the herb-scented air, Maestro Victor Karloff. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He offered a curt nod to the now thoroughly cowed herbalist. You have been most illuminating, madam. We shall trouble you no further, Sherlock Holmes responded. We turned to leave, the bell above the door sounding its tinny farewell as we stepped back into the grey afternoon. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed from a nearby mews. Karloff, I exclaimed, the moment we were on the pavement. The conductor with whom she had a known rivalry. What could be his interest in her anxieties, Holmes? Remarked Dr. John Watson. He paused on the pavement, his gaze distant, as if already piecing together the next fragment of the puzzle. A gust of wind swirled a few stray leaves around our feet. Rivalry, Watson, he mused, his voice thoughtful, can often mask deeper connections, or indeed deeper resentments. Our next port of call, I fancy, must be an interview with the maestro himself. His concern warrants closer scrutiny, declared Sherlock Holmes. The clue unearthed at the herbalist's, a mere whisper connecting Madame Dubois to Maestro Victor Karloff, had electrified Holmes. The grey London morning echoed our investigation's complexity. Carriage wheels on damp cobblestones and mournful calls from Thames bargemen wove a somber symphony around us. Holmes himself had spent the early hours pacing, a caged tiger. The name Karloff was a recurring motif in his low, muttered speculations, each repetition a sharp note in the quiet room. Karloff, Watson, the conductor, a man of temperament, of passion. My inquiries within the vibrant, often volatile, circles of London's musical society. The smoky green rooms of lesser concert halls, the hushed salons where reputations are made and unmade over brandy, the very establishments where musicians like Karloff seek solace or fuel their ambitions, suggest he bore Madame Dubois a professional animosity that bordered on obsession. It is high time we paid him a visit, Sherlock Holmes pointed out, as we rattled through the London streets in a hansom, the city's cacophony a stark contrast to the refined world of concert halls. I pondered Holmes's words. I pictured those dimly lit establishments. He alluded to places where the scent of stale tobacco and spilled wine mingled with the faint, lingering strains of music, where artistic temperaments flared and professional jealousies festered. It was a world far removed from the grand stages, yet intimately connected to the lives of those who graced them. Holmes's voice was crisp, devoid of any doubt. And so, we found ourselves shortly thereafter before the somewhat ostentatious residence of Maestro Karslov in a respectable, though not fashionable, quarter. The house itself seemed to hum with a suppressed energy. Even from the doorstep, I could faintly discern the disciplined strains of a distant violin. The music, precise and intense, was abruptly silenced as the door opened and we were admitted. A liveried servant, his footsteps soft on the polished floor, showed us into a large, somewhat cluttered drawing room. Sheet music lay in untidy piles, rustling faintly as a draught caught them, and a grand piano stood open, its keys gleaming. Maestro Victor Karslov entered with a flourish, his shoes clicking decisively on the parquet floor. He was a man of middling height, but immense presence, his dark hair swept back dramatically, his eyes, deep-set and intense, fixed upon Holmes with an unnerving scrutiny. "Mr. Holmes," his voice, resonant and carrying, filled the room. An unexpected, and I confess, intriguing honor. To what do I owe this visitation? Has the plight of poor Evangeline Dubois now become a matter for your particular talents? His tone was smooth, yet a keen ear might detect a subtle tremor beneath the polish, like a taut violin string about to snap. Remarked Maestro Victor Karslov. "Indeed, Maestro. Madame Dubois' disappearance is as perplexing as it is unfortunate. We are exploring all avenues. You were, I believe, acquainted with her professionally. Some say there was a notable rivalry," declared Sherlock Holmes. Karslov gave a dismissive wave of his hand, the fabric of his sleeve whispering with the movement, a gesture that seemed almost theatrical. "Rivalry," Karslov scoffed, his fingers drumming restlessly on a nearby table. "In art, Mr. Holmes, there is always competition. Evangeline possessed a rare gift, undeniably. That I acknowledged her talent, even as I strove to surpass it, is hardly suspicious." His carefully measured cadence belied his agitation, remarked Maestro Victor Karslov. Holmes's gaze, however, had drifted to a small, ornate writing desk in the corner. Half concealed beneath a sheaf of musical scores, I heard the slight rustle as he subtly shifted his weight to get a better view lay a sheet of distinctive lilac-tinted paper. It was crumpled and then hastily smoothed out. I saw Holmes's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. He continued his questioning, his voice deceptively mild, its calm tones a counterpoint to Karslov's barely concealed agitation. He drew the maestro out about performance schedules and mutual acquaintances. Yet, I knew that crumpled paper had registered deeply in Holmes's mind. Later, as we walked away from Karslov's residence, the myriad sounds of London, the clatter of hooves, the cries of street vendors, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer enveloped us once more. Holmes was unusually pensive, his silence a stark contrast to the city's hum. He broke this silence only when a street lad, one of his ubiquitous Baker Street Irregulars, darted from an alleyway. The scuff of his worn boots on the pavement was brief as he pressed a grimy note into Holmes's hand and vanished as quickly as he had appeared. Holmes unfolded it, the crinkle of the cheap paper audible, and read it, a grim satisfaction settling on his features. "This is most illuminating, Watson. It appears our maestro was not entirely candid regarding his whereabouts on the night of the performance. A tobacconist near the Lyceum, a reliable fellow, distinctly recalls seeing a man matching Karslov's description, agitated and cloaked, lingering near the stage door not an hour before Madame Dubois was due to play," explained Sherlock Holmes. "Good heavens, Holmes! The shadowy figure the stagehand mentioned," I exclaimed, the pieces falling into place with a sudden, startling clarity. Asked Dr. John Watson. "Precisely. The stagehand described a man of Karslov's build, cloaked and anxious. Karslov's denial of any deep personal involvement with Madame Dubois rings hollow, especially when I observed what appeared to be a fragment of a highly emotional letter, written on her preferred lilac stationery, discarded in his study. The crumpled state suggested a tempestuous exchange. His professional jealousy may have been the public face of a far more turbulent, private passion, Watson. A passion that perhaps led him to the theater that night, for reasons we must still uncover, replied Sherlock Holmes. The air, thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, seemed to hold its breath, the usual city clamor momentarily subdued. Holmes raised his hand, and a sharp whistle cut through the quiet. A passing hansom responded, its wheels clattering a sharp rhythm against the paving stones as it drew to a halt beside us. Karslof's role is now clear, at least in part. But to understand Madame Dubois' actions, her motives, her fears, our next destination, Watson, must be her lodgings. It is time we examined the stage from which our vanishing violinist made her exit, explained Sherlock Holmes. The affair of Maestro Karsloff, now identified as the shadowy figure from the theater, had certainly cast a new, if murky, light upon the case. Yet, as was his wont, Holmes remained unsatisfied. He declared that Karsloff's role, while significant, did not fully explain Madame Dubois' vanishing. Thus, the following morning, a grey and drizzling Tuesday that did little to lift my own spirits, found us once more in a cab. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on the wet cobbles and the steady drumming of rain against the carriage roof accompanied our journey as we rattled towards the less fashionable district where the violinist had kept her rooms. Karsloff may have been a factor, Watson, a catalyst perhaps, but the true genesis of this flight. For I am increasingly convinced his flight lies within the lady herself. We must seek her story in the place she called home, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Madame Dubois' lodgings were in a narrow terraced house, its brickwork stained by London's perpetual damp, a stark contrast, I reflected, to the grandeur of the concert hall she had so recently fled. The air here was quieter than in the bustling thoroughfares I knew so well. The primary sounds were but the distant clip-clop of a dray horse and the mournful sigh of the wind whistling through the chimney pots. Our knock at the door echoed briefly before a rather flustered woman, her apron still bearing traces of breakfast preparations, answered our summons. This, we learned, was Mrs. Higgins, the landlady. Her voice was thin and carried a note of anxiety as she spoke. "Mr. Holmes, is it? Oh dear, such a worry, Madame Dubois. A quiet tenant, very quiet. Kept to herself, she did," remarked Mrs. Higgins. She led us up a narrow flight of stairs, the treads groaning softly under our weight, a sound that seemed to echo the quiet desperation of the place. Each step creaked a mournful complaint. We were shown into a small room at the back of the house. The chamber was Spartan, almost monastic. Our footsteps echoed in the bare space. A narrow bed creaked as Holmes brushed past, his coat rustling against a plain washstand. A single armchair and a small writing desk completed the meager furnishings. The only hint of Madame Dubois' profession was a simple music stand, currently bare. A faint, lingering scent of lavender and old paper hung in the air, a ghostly reminder of its recent occupant. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the distant, muffled sounds of the city. "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins. We shall not disturb you for long," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His tone was gentle, yet firm. The landlady, with a final worried glance, retreated, her footsteps receding down the creaking stairs, each creak a soft complaint in the otherwise quiet house. Holmes, as was his custom, wasted no time. I watched, fascinated as ever, as his keen eyes swept the room, his long, deft fingers soon exploring the few possessions left behind. He moved with a curious quietness, a feline grace that always impressed me. The only sounds the faint rustle of his coat and the occasional soft click as he examined a drawer or a small box. "Observe, Watson," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes's voice lowered conspiratorially. "Simplicity, yes, but also order, and something more." He gestured to the bed. "Do you see? A small, neatly folded pile of clothing. Practical garments, Watson, suitable for travel, not for the concert stage." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He moved to the waste paper basket. And here, a railway timetable. Notice how the coastal lines are heavily scored, Sherlock Holmes noted. My companion then turned his attention to the modest writing desk. I held my breath, for I knew that look of intense scrutiny on his face. After a moment, he pressed a particular spot on its underside. A faint click, barely audible even to my straining ears, was followed by the release of a shallow, hidden drawer. Inside, as Holmes no doubt anticipated, lay a small, leather-bound volume. Ah, the inevitable diary. Women of a sensitive disposition, particularly those under strain, often confide their innermost thoughts to such companions, Sherlock Holmes noted. His voice was low, almost a murmur, as he carefully opened it, the ancient leather cover sighing faintly. He perused its pages rapidly, his brow furrowed in that familiar look of intense concentration. The scratching of his fingernail against paper was the only sound for what seemed an age, each second stretching out as I waited, the silence punctuated only by the rustle of turning leaves. Most entries, from what I could glimpse, seemed to be brief, mundane observations or notes on musical scores. Hardly the stuff of high drama, I thought. Then Holmes paused, his gaze fixed upon a particular page, and a sharp intake of breath from him told me he had found something of import. This is suggestive. Listen to this, Watson, from an entry made but a week ago. The pressure mounts. The stage feels a cage. I yearn for the quiet solace of the whispering reeds, the place where childhood dreams took flight, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Whispering reeds, a place of childhood dreams, I queried. It sounds like a poetical fancy, Holmes, not a destination, commented Dr. John Watson. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the page. Poetical, yes, but also specific, I fancy. Not a literal address, perhaps, but a cipher for a deeply personal sanctuary, a safe haven known only to her or to those intimately acquainted with her early life. This was no abduction, Watson. This was an escape, meticulously planned. She sought refuge from a world she found unbearable, declared Sherlock Holmes. He closed the diary with a decisive snap, a sound that seemed to punctuate his conclusion. The implications, as Holmes laid them out, were indeed clear. Madame Dubois had fled, not been taken. The pressures he spoke of, the cage she felt the stage to be, immediately brought to my own mind the ambitious, and perhaps ruthless, concert manager, Mr. Finch. The strain upon her must have been immense. I think, Watson, our next conversation must be with Mr. Alastair Finch. He may shed more light than he intends upon the nature of these pressures. Sherlock Holmes responded. His voice held a steely edge, promising a less than comfortable interview for the theater manager. The very air in the small room seemed to crackle with Holmes's resolve. The coded reference to her childhood solace remained an enigma, a tantalizing clue that hung in the air of that sparse little room, the silence now heavy with unspoken questions. It promised, I felt, yet further complexities in this already intricate case, complexities that only Holmes, with his unique gifts, could hope to unravel. The key to its meaning, Holmes surmised, likely lay buried in a past we had yet to uncover. As we prepared to depart, the only sound was the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the Thames, a fitting underscore to the mystery that still enveloped us. I knew another journey of discovery lay before us. Deep within the concert hall's grand edifice lay Mr. Alastair Finch's offices, a warren of plush carpets and heavy mahogany. Distant, muted orchestral strains occasionally pierced the reverent silence of the corridors. His own sanctum was imposing, a large desk, dim light from curtained windows, and the scent of old leather and cigars. A grandfather clock's ponderous tick-tock was the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, an unexpected visit. To what do I owe the honor, gentlemen? I trust there is news of Madame Dubois. His voice was sonorous, accustomed to command. Mr. Alastair Finch answered. News is what we seek, Mr. Finch, rather than bring. Specifically, regarding the nature of your professional association with the lady and the atmosphere preceding her disappearance, observed Sherlock Holmes. Finch steepled his fingers, a portrait of executive composure, yet a slight drumming of one manicured nail upon the desk betrayed an inner disquiet. Atmosphere. Madame Dubois was a consummate professional, if somewhat temperamental. Artists, you understand. We had a clear contract, high expectations on both sides. Naturally, I encouraged her to meet those expectations. The public, Mr. Holmes, is a demanding mistress, answered Mr. Alastair Finch. Encouragement, Mr. Finch, can take many forms. My information suggests your form was rather relentless, that the demands placed upon Madame Dubois were extraordinary, her schedule punishing, her contractual obligations leveraged to ensure compliance, regardless of her personal state. Is that not a more accurate summation? Replied Sherlock Holmes. The manager's face flushed a deeper crimson. He opened his mouth to issue what I expected to be a forceful denial, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The grandfather clock ticked on, each beat amplifying the tension. It is a competitive world, Mr. Holmes, he began, his voice losing some of its smooth timbre, becoming strained. One must extract the utmost value from one's assets. She was a star, a phenomenon. The backers, the patrons, they expected brilliance at every turn, remarked Mr. Alastair Finch. And you were the instrument of that extraction, Holmes pressed, his tone unwavering. Did it occur to you, Mr. Finch, that such relentless pressure might drive a sensitive artist not to greater heights, but to desperate measures? Explained Sherlock Holmes. It was then that the carefully constructed facade of Alastair Finch shattered. His shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. A muffled sound, half groan, half sob, escaped him. The powerful manager, the man who held sway over careers and commanded stages, was suddenly a figure of profound distress. You don't understand, he choked out, voice thick with unshed tears. The debts, the hall's reputation, my livelihood. I was leveraged, Holmes, by men who care nothing for art, only profit. Yes, I pushed her. I threatened her with ruin if she faltered. I reminded her of every clause, every penalty. What choice did I have? She was my only means to keep afloat in a sea of sharks. If she failed, I failed, and everything would be lost, remarked Mr. Alastair Finch. Finch looked up, eyes wild and bloodshot, his hair disheveled. The confession poured out, a torrent of fear, ambition, and the crushing weight of expectation he had inflicted upon Madame Dubois. It was a stark revelation of the machinery behind the glittering curtain, a world where talent was commodity and the human spirit secondary to the balance sheet. Holmes listened, expression unreadable. As Finch fell silent, exhausted, Holmes rose. Your predicament, Mr. Finch, illuminates the immense strain under which Madame Dubois labored. It confirms the motive for her desire to escape this life. However, he added, his voice returning to its customary crispness, it does not explain the method of her vanishing, nor who might have aided such a desperate flight, replied Sherlock Holmes. We left Mr. Finch, a crumpled figure amidst the symbols of his precarious success. As the heavy office door clicked shut, the distant, melancholic scales of a practicing violin drifted down the corridor, a poignant commentary on the pressures Finch had laid bare, and a reminder that our quarry, her reasons for flight clearer, remained stubbornly elusive. The Diogenes Club, that most unsociable of London institutions, offered the perfect sanctuary for the delicate conversation Holmes intended to have. We were ensconced in a small, private chamber, the silence profound and almost palpable, broken only by the distant, muffled rustle of a turning newspaper page from the stranger's room, a sound that seemed to emphasize the quiet rather than disturb it, and the occasional hushed footfall of a club servant on the thick, sound-dampening carpet outside. The very air in the room felt heavy, expectant. Maestro Victor Karslov sat opposite us, his usually flamboyant demeanor subdued, his dark eyes fixed upon Holmes with an air of wary anticipation. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, but carried the distinct edge of authority. "Maestro Karloff, we have spoken of professional rivalries and artistic temperaments. I fancy, however, that your connection to Madame Evangeline Dubois extended somewhat beyond the conductor's podium and the soloist's platform," observed Sherlock Holmes. Karloff shifted in his chair, the faint creak of leather the only sound for a moment. He ran a hand through his already disheveled dark hair. His reply was strained, a mere whisper. "I admired her talent, Mr. Holmes, immensely, as did all the world," responded Maestro Victor Karloff. "Admiration, yes," Holmes conceded, his gaze unwavering. "But I refer to something more personal," observed Sherlock Holmes. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "For instance, Maestro, this rather unique brand of Russian papyrosa, your favored choice, I believe. Several stubs were discovered in a secluded alcove near the stage door. My sources report 2 figures frequenting this spot in the late hours. One, a woman of Madame Dubois' stature. The other, a gentleman bearing a striking resemblance to yourself," declared Sherlock Holmes. The maestro's composure crumbled before our eyes. His shoulders slumped, and a deep, sorrowful sigh escaped him, seeming to echo in the hushed chamber. The fight drained from his posture, leaving only a man laid bare by truth. His voice, when he spoke again, was thick with emotion, the cultured accent roughened. "It is true. Evangeline, she and I, we were more than colleagues. We loved one another," Maestro Victor Karloff said. He paused, collecting himself, the confession hanging in the air between us. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, whose expression remained impassive, though I sensed a flicker of understanding in his keen eyes. The pressure, Mr. Holmes, it was unbearable for her. Finch, the critics, the endless demands. She felt trapped, a songbird in a gilded cage, Maestro Victor Karloff said. He gestured vaguely, a sweep of his hand that encompassed an unseen world of torment. The clink of a glass from a distant part of the club, perhaps the stranger's room, was the only sound for a moment, a tiny punctuation in the heavy atmosphere. So we made a plan, a desperate, beautiful plan. "An escape," Holmes prompted gently, deduced Sherlock Holmes. "To leave London, to leave it all behind," answered Maestro Victor Karloff. His gaze seemed to turn inward, lost in the vision of that escape. Outside, a carriage rumbled faintly on the cobbled street beyond the club's thick walls, a distant reminder of the city they sought to flee. "We were to meet after her performance, or rather, what should have been her performance," replied Maestro Victor Karloff. A tremor ran through his voice, and he swallowed hard, the sound distinct in the quiet room. "I had arranged passage to Cherbourg, then onward to a quiet villa in the Italian countryside where she could play for herself, for the joy of it, not for them," responded Maestro Victor Karloff. The maestro paused, the memory clearly painful. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by his ragged breathing. From the Thames, the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn seemed to seep through the very walls of the club, a sound that amplified the unspoken weight of his words. "I waited, Mr. Holmes," he resumed, his voice strained. "At our agreed rendezvous, a small, discreet hotel near Charing Cross. I watched him, a man clearly wrestling with a profound and agonizing mystery. The fire in the grate had died down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the paneled walls, the room growing cooler. I waited all night. Each chime of a distant clock, each mournful cry of those foghorns on the Thames you just heard, seemed to echo my own despair as the hours crept by." His voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands for a moment. The raw pain in his admission was undeniable. "She never came," he continued, his voice muffled for a moment as he briefly covered his face. Then he looked up, his own a mask of bewildered grief. Maestro Victor Karslov said. The quiet of the Diogenes Club seemed to press in, amplifying the starkness of his admission. Even the rustle of newspapers from the stranger's room seemed to have ceased. I do not understand it. We planned every detail, every contingency. She was as eager as I, Maestro Victor Karslov replied. He shook his head, a gesture of utter incomprehension. The scent of his Russian papyroses, usually a mark of his confident presence, seemed to have faded, replaced by an air of pure desolation. Why she would vanish, he continued, his voice now laced with desperation. Why she would not come to me, it is a torment beyond words. Maestro Victor Karslov replied. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, the old leather groaning faintly under the pressure, a small, protesting sound in the otherwise still room. I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I had no part in this other vanishing. I expected her by my side, Maestro Victor Karslov replied. I believe you, Maestro, Holmes said, his tone unexpectedly soft. Your distress is quite genuine. It seems Madame Dubois, for reasons yet unknown, deviated from your shared itinerary. She sought a different sanctuary, one perhaps even you were not privy to, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Holmes rose, and I followed suit. The maestro remained seated, a figure of profound dejection, the dying embers in the fireplace reflecting in his downcast eyes. The truth of his relationship with Madame Dubois had been laid bare, yet it only served to deepen the central enigma of her solitary flight. If not with Karslov, then where, and why the sudden, silent alteration to their meticulously crafted escape? The concert hall's backstage drama had yielded one secret, but Madame Dubois' own heart, it seemed, held another, more elusive still. As we departed, the heavy oak door of the private chamber closed behind us with a soft, decisive click, sealing the maestro in with his sorrow, and leaving us to the quiet, echoing corridors of the Diogenes Club, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. The Maestro Karslov's rather astonishing account of a meticulously planned elopement, and Madame Dubois' inexplicable failure to appear at their rendezvous, had plunged both Holmes and myself into a state of considerable perplexity. It felt as though the fog of the unknown, much like the grey London mist pressing against our Baker Street window panes and muffling the distant clatter of hooves, was determined to obscure our path. Holmes, I observed, had been pacing for the better part of an hour, a coiled spring of restless energy, his brow furrowed in that familiar way that preceded either a breakthrough or a deeper descent into the problem. The quiet hum of the afternoon, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the floorboards beneath Holmes's restless feet, was then pierced by the sharp summons of our doorbell. A few moments later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in Miss Sarah Marfat, the young seamstress from the theater. Her usually bright countenance was quite clouded with an anxious urgency, her fingers twisting the fringe of her shawl as if seeking some purchase against an unseen current. She clutched it tightly about her, a shiver running through her despite the cheerful crackle of the fire in our hearth, a clear sign of nervous agitation, I thought. Mr. Holmes, sir, forgive me for bursting in, but something's come to mind. I thought it just a bit nonsense before, but now, well, now I reckon it might be important, Sarah Marfat said. He stopped his pacing instantly, his gaze sharp and direct. Pray, continue, Miss Marfat. Any detail, however trivial it may seem, could prove to be the very keystone we seek, replied Sherlock Holmes. It was something Madame Dubois said, a few weeks back, just casual-like, she began, her brow furrowed as she tried to recall it proper. We was chatting about when we were young. We don't often get to talk personal, see. She spoke, almost sadly, of a special place, a sort of childhood hidey-hole she called her Little Hermitage. Said it was near Oakhaven in Sussex. The only spot, she told me, where she ever felt truly peaceful, where no one was watching her, remarked Sarah Marfat. Holmes's eyes, which had been intently fixed upon Miss Marfat, suddenly lit with that familiar, keen intensity I knew so well, the look of a hunter who has just caught the scent of his quarry. He strode to his cluttered writing desk, papers rustling crisply as he retrieved a small, folded sheet, the cryptic note we had discovered in Madame Dubois' dressing room. His voice, when he spoke, vibrated with suppressed excitement. "Watson, you recall the cipher, the one that spoke of finding childhood solace?" He held the paper aloft. "Miss Marfat, your recollection is invaluable. A little hermitage near Oakhaven, you say," declared Sherlock Holmes. She nodded eagerly. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, that's the one. Oakhaven. She said it was proper out of the way, like tucked in amongst the trees," Sarah Marfat replied. "Remarkable," Holmes exclaimed. "Miss Marfat, your little hermitage is the key to this cipher. What once seemed vague now points clearly to Oakhaven. This sequence here," he tapped the note, "now resolves into a precise location." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He turned to me, his face alight with that expression of triumphant clarity I had witnessed on so many occasions. It was always a marvel to observe how, with a single new fact, Holmes could make the scattered pieces of the most baffling puzzle click into a coherent whole. In that moment, the everyday sounds of the city outside, a newsboy's distant cry, the rumble of a passing dray seemed to recede, overshadowed by the brilliance of the solution presenting itself before us. Madame Dubois is not merely hiding, Watson. She has retreated to the one place she believes herself to be truly safe, invulnerable. She is, I am quite certain, at her childhood sanctuary near Oakhaven in Sussex. "There is no time to lose," remarked Sherlock Holmes. "Good heavens, Holmes," I exclaimed, the familiar thrill of impending action coursing through me. "Then our course is clear. We make for Sussex at once?" asked Dr. John Watson. He was already reaching for his traveling cloak. "Indeed, Watson. Miss Marfat, your intuition has served us splendidly. We shall ascertain the truth of this matter without delay. The game, as they say, is afoot once more," observed Sherlock Holmes. The quiet study crackled with newfound energy. As Holmes and I prepared for our journey, the promise of solving Madame Dubois' disappearance hung tangibly in the air. The culmination of Holmes's deductions, guided by Miss Marfat's timely recollection, led our hired trap through winding, increasingly rustic lanes. A chill autumn wind whipped through the nearly bare branches of the trees lining our path, whistling a mournful tune and carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The air grew colder. At last, as twilight began to bleed across the gray sky, we drew up before a small, isolated cottage. Its stone walls, slick with moss in places, were deeply weathered, and its thatched roof sagged precariously. A thin, almost hesitant wisp of smoke curled from its single chimney, a fragile signal of life against the encroaching gloom. "A sanctuary sought, Watson. Let us see if its peace has served its purpose," explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes alighted, his movements precise even on the uneven ground. Miss Marfat followed, her expression a mixture of anxiety and resolve. I brought up the rear. The front door was unlatched. Holmes pushed it inward with a gentle pressure, the hinges groaning a mournful welcome. Inside, the air was close, thick with the smell of wood smoke and something faintly herbal. It was warmed by a small fire that crackled softly in the hearth, its flames the only source of light, casting flickering, dancing shadows upon simple, rustic furnishings and the rough-hewn wooden walls. And there, seated in a plain wooden chair, her back to us, was Madame Evangeline Dubois. She turned as the draft from the open door reached her, her face pale but composed, her eyes wide with a startled, hunted look that swiftly gave way to weary resignation. "So you have found me, Mr. Holmes," Madame Evangeline Dubois replied. "Indeed, Madame. The music has paused, but the composition is not yet complete. We came, hoping to understand the sudden silence," remarked Sherlock Holmes. She gestured to a nearby stool, and Holmes and I seated ourselves, whilst Miss Marfat remained standing, a supportive, if silent, presence near the doorway. The only sounds for a moment were the pop and hiss of the fire and the distant, melancholy call of an owl. You cannot imagine the weight of it, Mr. Holmes. The eyes, always the eyes. The whispers, remarked Madame Evangeline Dubois. She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped teacup on the small table beside her. The fire popped, sending a brief shower of sparks upwards. Mr. Finch, with his relentless schedules, his pronouncements that my life was no longer my own. Each performance became a precipice, and I feared the fall more than I cherished the flight. Madame Evangeline Dubois answered. I watched her, a woman of immense talent, yet broken by the very world that professed to adore her. It was a story I had seen shadowed in other lives, though rarely with such dramatic consequence. And the matter of your rather theatrical exit from the lyric theatre, Madame. The locked room that baffled so many, stated Sherlock Holmes. Ah, that. It was simpler than you might imagine, Mr. Holmes. An old-fashioned latch, a length of silk thread, and a bit of ingenuity. I looped one end around the interior bolt, passed the thread beneath the door, and from outside pulled it taut to draw the bolt closed. A sharp tug snapped the weakened thread, leaving no trace. A child's trick, really, but it bought me the time I needed, responded Madame Evangeline Dubois. Holmes nodded slowly, a gleam of appreciation in his eyes for the elegant simplicity of the ruse. Ingenious, Madame. The illusion of impossibility is often crafted from the threads of the overlooked. And Maestro Karslov, he was to be your confederate in this flight, I surmise, part of your initial design, Sherlock Holmes said. Victor, yes. He offered assistance, a way out, a place to rest. Madame Evangeline Dubois replied. A shadow passed over her face, and she looked away from the fire, towards the small, grimy window against which the wind pressed. But as the moment approached, even that felt like another cage, another expectation. The note I left for him was true in its sentiment of needing escape, but I could not bring myself to meet him then. The wind outside seemed to moan in sympathy, a low, mournful sound. The pressure had become so absolute that only true, unadulterated solitude seemed bearable. She paused, her gaze distant, as if reliving the suffocating weight of those final moments before her flight. The small, flickering fire seemed to be the only thing holding the encroaching darkness at bay. This cottage, a place from my childhood imaginings, became the only sanctuary my heart could accept. I needed to be utterly alone, to hear only the wind and my own thoughts, to find some piece of myself again, replied Madame Evangeline Dubois. Miss Marfort took a hesitant step forward, her hands clasped. Madame, what you describe is the weight of expectation, the loss of oneself. It is a story many women in the public eye could tell, though few dare, said Sarah Marfort. Madame Dubois turned her head slowly to look at Sarah, a flicker of surprise, then perhaps understanding in her expression. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the fire. We, who work behind the scenes, often witness the toll it takes. Your desire for true solitude, for a moment to breathe, is deeply understood, Sarah Marfort said. Indeed, I added, my tone earnest. But your music, Madame Dubois, it brings solace to so many. Is there no way to bridge this chasm, to find a path back that respects your spirit? Dr. John Watson replied. Return to that? Oh, Dr. Watson, the very thought fills me with a dread I cannot articulate. How can I face them again, knowing what I now know of myself, of my own fragility? Responded Madame Evangeline Dubois. The small room seemed to shrink, heavy with Madame Dubois' despair and the unspoken question of her future. In the strained silence, only the fire's soft crackling could be heard. Fragility, Madame, can also be the birthplace of a new strength. The decision, of course, is yours, Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes paused, his gaze steady and direct, yet not unkind. The shadows thrown by the firelight danced on the walls, making the small room seem both intimate and vast. But consider this. A voice silenced by fear benefits no one, least of all the one who possesses it. The world awaits your next movement," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Madame Dubois looked from Holmes to me, then to Sarah Marfat, her expression unreadable. The wind pressed against the cottage eaves, a mournful, searching sound, as if echoing the turmoil within her. Her answer, it was clear, would not come easily, hanging suspended like an unresolved cord. The fire in the cottage hearth had dwindled to embers, mirroring the fragile hope within Madame Dubois. Yet, Sarah Marfat's earnest words, and indeed Holmes's uncharacteristically gentle persuasion, seemed to kindle a new spark. The distant, mournful cry of a curlew outside punctuated the silence that followed her tearful confession. Her voice, though still bearing the tremor of her recent ordeal, held a nascent resolve. If what you say is true, Miss Marfat, that there are those who would stand with me, and Mr. Holmes, if you believe terms can be met that do not crush the spirit, then perhaps I can face them again," replied Madame Evangeline Dubois. "We do more than stand, Madame," Sarah replied, her tone firm and reassuring. "We are a network. We see, we hear, and we support our own. You will not be isolated again," Sarah Marfat answered. Holmes rose, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the lamplight. The faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke clung to the air. "Then let us not delay, Madame. The stage awaits, but on your terms. Watson, we return to London. There is a concert manager who requires a lesson in artistic appreciation and human decency," Sherlock Holmes noted. Our journey back to the city was swift, a stark contrast to the hesitant progress of the preceding days. The familiar clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the distant hum of the metropolis grew louder, heralding our arrival at the grand, yet currently subdued, concert hall. Mr. Alastair Finch, summoned by a curt message from Holmes, met us in the cavernous, chilly backstage area. The usual pre-performance bustle was absent. Instead, a few stagehands moved about with a desultory air, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. His voice was a mixture of relief and bluster, tight with barely concealed agitation. "Holmes, so you found her. Madame Dubois, you have caused an unprecedented degree of chaos. The patrons, the press," Mr. Alastair Finch answered. Holmes cut him off, his own voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable authority that made Finch falter. "Mr. Finch, the only chaos I observe is that born of your own making. Madame Dubois is prepared to honor her commitment to perform, but not under the duress she has previously endured," Sherlock Holmes responded. Finch puffed out his chest, his face reddening. "Duress," Finch sputtered. "I provide a platform for her genius. She has a contract," answered Mr. Alastair Finch. "A contract which, I have ascertained, made insufficient provision for the immense pressures placed upon her, particularly as a woman in the public glare. Observe, Finch, the cancelled posters for her replacements, hastily plastered over. Note the distinct lack of enthusiasm from your remaining staff. My informants report dwindling advance bookings and a general air of public disappointment. You need Madame Dubois, sir, far more than she, at this moment, needs this particular stage under its current management," observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's words, delivered with chilling precision, seemed to deflate the manager. The sharp tang of old dust and stage paint seemed to grow stronger as Finch visibly sagged. He glanced towards Madame Dubois, who stood pale but resolute, flanked by Sarah Marfat, and two other women I recognized as members of the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood, a seamstress and a program seller, their presence a quiet bulwark. "Therefore," Holmes continued, his tone softening almost imperceptibly as he gestured towards the violinist, "new terms will be drafted. These terms will ensure her privacy, limit her engagements to a manageable number, provide for proper rest, and acknowledge her artistic autonomy. Furthermore, Miss Marfat here will act as her dedicated liaison to ensure these terms are upheld. Fail to agree, and I shall feel compelled to share my findings regarding the shall we say, exploitative nature of certain theatrical contracts with several influential newspapers, I believe they would find the narrative most compelling, replied Sherlock Holmes. Finch swallowed, his eyes darting between Holmes and the silent violinist. The implied threat, coupled with the undeniable truth of his predicament, was clearly effective. A low murmur of agreement came from Sarah Moffat's companions. He managed a week. This is highly irregular, Holmes, answered Mr. Alastair Finch. Perhaps, but justice and compassion, Mr. Finch, are never irregular. They are merely, at times, inconvenient for those who disregard them. You will find these new arrangements ultimately more harmonious for all concerned. He spoke with a finality that brooked no further argument. Sherlock Holmes noted. Later, the faint, hurried footsteps of Finch faded as he scurried away to consult his legal advisors. Sarah Moffat and her companions then approached Madame Dubois. The echoing quiet of the backstage area was broken by their soft voices. "Madame," Sarah began, her voice warm, "we meant what we said. There will always be one of us nearby. A friendly face, a word of support, practical help if you need it. You are not walking this path alone any longer," Sarah Moffat said. A genuine smile, the first I had seen from her that was not tinged with sorrow, touched Madame Dubois' lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "From the bottom of my heart, thank you all," Madame Evangeline Dubois answered. Holmes watched them, a rare expression of satisfaction softening his features. He had not merely solved a puzzle. He had, with the unexpected aid of these remarkable women, helped to mend a fractured spirit. In the hushed auditorium beyond, the great curtain seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the music that was yet to come. The air within the grand concert hall crackled with an anticipation I had seldom witnessed. A low murmur, the rustle of silk and programs, filled the moments before the curtain was to rise. It was a far cry from the strained atmosphere of our previous visits. A palpable sense of hope, and indeed of amends made, now permeated the very velvet of the drapes. Holmes, beside me, surveyed the scene with that keen, quiet intensity of his, a subtle upturn at the corner of his lips, the only indication of his satisfaction. Then a hush fell. From the wings, Madame Evangeline Dubois emerged, not with the hesitant trepidation of before, but with a serene composure that spoke volumes. The gasps of the audience were soft, like a collective intake of breath, followed by a ripple of applause that swelled as she took her place, her violin held as if it were an extension of her very soul. The lights caught the warm wood of the instrument, and for a moment, all else faded. Her first note, when it came, was pure and unwavering, soaring through the auditorium with a strength that belied any past fragility. It was not merely a performance. It was a declaration. I saw Mr. Finch, the hall manager, standing near an exit, his usual imperious expression softened, replaced by something akin to genuine admiration. Even Maestro Karslov, in the orchestra pit, watched her with an unfeigned respect that transcended any former rivalry. I fancied I caught a glimpse of Sarah Moffat in one of the boxes, a proud, knowing smile upon her face. The music swelled and cascaded, a triumphant journey through sorrow and into light. When the final, resonant chord faded into silence, the stillness held for but a heartbeat. Then the hall erupted. It was not mere applause, but a roar, a wave of sound that buffeted us. The entire assembly was on its feet, a sea of cheering faces. Madame Dubois, her head bowed, then raised it to meet their adulation. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, yet her eyes shone with a reclaimed, luminous strength. His voice, when he spoke close to my ear amidst the din, was calm. "Observe, Watson, the human spirit, when afforded true agency, possesses a remarkable resilience. Even Mr. Finch appears to have discovered the benefits of fostering talent rather than merely exploiting it," replied Sherlock Holmes. Later that evening, the familiar comfort of our Baker Street lodgings enveloped us. The sharp scent of coal smoke from our hearth mingled with the damp London air that drifted through the slightly ajar window, carrying the distant rumble of late carriages on the cobbled streets. The sounds of the city were a familiar symphony, a backdrop to our reflections. He had been standing by the mantelpiece, gazing into the flames, but turned then, his expression thoughtful. An illuminating case, Watson, would you not agree? More so, perhaps, for what it revealed of the unseen currents within our society than for the complexity of its initial puzzle, explained Sherlock Holmes. I nodded, my heart still stirred by the evening's events. Indeed, Holmes, Madame Dubois' courage was remarkable. To return to that stage, after all she had endured, Dr. John Watson replied. Holmes began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, a habit when he was deep in thought. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his tread. Her courage, yes, but also the insidious pressures that nearly crushed it. This affair has laid bare the peculiar burdens placed upon women who step into the public glare, expected to be paragons of both talent and propriety, yet often treated as mere commodities, their private anxieties dismissed, their professional contributions undervalued. The efforts of young Sarah Moffat and her compatriots in the sisterhood were instrumental, not merely in providing information, but in offering a web of genuine support, a stark contrast to the isolation Madame Dubois had previously faced, remarked Sherlock Holmes. I considered his words. There was a depth of understanding in his tone that went beyond mere intellectual assessment, a hint, perhaps, of an evolving empathy I had noted with increasing frequency of late. This case, it seemed, had touched upon something fundamental. It speaks volumes, Holmes, I replied, my voice earnest, of the quiet battles fought daily, and the profound courage it takes for many, particularly women, to simply claim their rightful place in this demanding world. The value of such solidarity, as demonstrated by those good women, cannot be overstated, responded Dr. John Watson. He stopped his pacing and met my gaze, a rare, almost gentle smile touching his lips. And the power of a little understanding, Watson, a commodity often scarcer and more valuable than any jewel. It is the quiet observation of such human truths, as much as the unraveling of criminal intrigue, that lends our work its true savor. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows upon the walls, filled with the reassuring clutter of our shared life. The great city outside hummed its ceaseless song, but here, within these rooms, there was a sense of completion, not just of a case concluded, but of a deeper lesson absorbed. The vanishing violinist had found her voice again, and in doing so, had amplified a message far greater than any single melody.